What if the key to unlocking your entire future was hidden in the past, trapped in a voice you never thought you'd hear again? For one waitress, struggling under the weight of hospital bills and faded dreams, a single sound changed everything. This is a story about a forgotten recording, a billionaire's lonely secret, and a test of character so profound it could either shatter a life built on lies or forge a future from the embers of truth. Alara traced the rim of a coffee cup, the diner's harsh fluorescent lights buzzing a weary tune that matched the ache in her bones. Every day was the same. The clatter of plates, the smell of burnt coffee, the forced smiles for customers who saw right through her. After her shift, she would go to the hospital, sit by her mother's bed, and pretend that the mountain of debt wasn't crushing them both. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. In the corner booth, a man sat alone, as he did every Tuesday. He was older, with eyes that held the quiet gravity of immense power and profound loss. He never said much, just ordered black coffee and stared out the window. The staff called him Mr. Sterling, a name whispered with the reverence reserved for local legends. He owned half the city, they said, but he looked like he'd lost the whole world. Tonight, however, was different. He wasn't looking out the window. He was staring at an old, sleek phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. A moment later, a voice filled the quiet space around his booth. A man's voice, warm and full of laughter, captured on a recording decades old. "And I'm telling you, Arthur, it's going to work. This isn't just about business. It's about building something that lasts, something for our families." Alara froze, the coffee pot in her hand trembling. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate drumbeat. She knew that laugh. She knew that cadence, that hopeful energy. It was a ghost from a life she barely remembered, a melody from a lullaby sung long ago. She took a tentative step forward, then another, drawn by an invisible force. "Sir?" she whispered, her own voice barely audible. Mr. Sterling looked up, his expression guarded, annoyed at the interruption. I'm sorry to bother you," Alara stammered, her gaze fixed on his phone. "But that voice, that recording." "Sir, that voice recording is my dad." The world seemed to stop. The clatter of the diner faded into a dull roar. Arthur Sterling's carefully constructed mask of indifference shattered, replaced by raw, unfiltered shock. His grip loosened, and the expensive phone clattered onto the table, the recording falling silent. He stared at the young waitress, at her wide, tear-filled eyes, and saw not a stranger, but the echo of a ghost he had spent 25 years trying to forget. The past had just walked up to his table and asked for a refill. For a long moment, Arthur Sterling simply stared, his mind reeling. The girl, the waitress, looked no older than 25. Her face was etched with a weariness that didn't belong on someone so young. Yet her eyes held a flicker of the same fire he remembered from so long ago. He saw the resemblance now, a ghost image of his best friend, Daniel, superimposed over her features. "What did you say?" His voice was a low rasp, stripped of its usual authority. "My father," Alara repeated, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "His name was Daniel Archer." That sounded exactly like him. He used to tell me stories with that same laugh. Daniel Archer. The name was a key turning a rusted lock in the deepest chamber of his heart. He hadn't spoken it aloud in decades. To the world, Daniel Archer was a footnote in Sterling Corp's history. The brilliant partner who betrayed him, stole proprietary research, and vanished, leaving Arthur to build an empire from the ashes of their friendship. Sterling picked up his phone, his hand unsteady. He looked from the device to her face, a storm of doubt, suspicion, and a terrifying sliver of hope churning within him. "That's impossible. Please," she begged, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "Can you play it again?" He hesitated, then pressed play. The warm, confident voice filled the air once more. Alara closed her eyes, a sob catching in her throat. It was him. It was the father she only knew from a single faded photograph and her mother's fragmented, grief-stricken stories. Arthur watched her, his cynicism warring with the undeniable truth of her reaction. This wasn't a trick. This was raw, painful recognition. He switched off the recording. "Sit down," he commanded, his tone softer now. He gestured to the empty seat opposite him. Alara slid into the booth, her server's apron feeling like a costume in a play she didn't understand. He studied her for a full minute, his gaze intense, searching. "Tell me about your mother," he said finally. "She's sick," Alara replied, the words coming out in a rush of exhaustion. "Cancer. The treatments are expensive. I work double shifts here, but it's never enough." He nodded slowly, processing. The fit. A struggling daughter, a sick mother. The perfect setup for a con. And yet, "If I help you," he began, the words careful, deliberate. "If I take care of your mother's medical bills, all of them, will you help me? I need to understand. I need to know everything you know about your father." Alara's breath hitched. It was an offer from a fairy tale, a lifeline thrown into the dark ocean of her despair. Felt too good to be true. "Help you how?" "By answering my questions. By telling me what happened to him, to your family, after he left." The word "left" was laced with a quarter-century of bitterness. She looked at this powerful, broken man and saw a reflection of her own life. A life defined by a gaping absence. For her mother, she would do anything. For the chance to finally understand the shadow that had loomed over her entire existence, she would do even more. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and firm. "Anything." The next morning, a black car, silent and imposing, waited for Alara outside her cramped apartment building. The ride to Arthur Sterling's penthouse was a journey to another planet. She left behind the cracked pavement and gritty reality of her world and ascended into the sky, into a realm of polished glass and cold, minimalist luxury. The penthouse was less a home than a museum, a vast, sterile space with panoramic views of a city that had always felt alien and intimidating. Arthur was waiting for her in a cavernous study lined with books he'd likely never read. He gestured for her to sit in a leather armchair that swallowed her whole. On a large mahogany desk between them lay a single, thin file. "This is all I have left of him," Arthur said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. The official version, anyway. He opened the file. It contained a yellowed newspaper clipping announcing the dissolution of their partnership and a formal legal document citing breach of contract and theft of intellectual property. "The story, as I've told it to myself for 25 years, is that Daniel, my partner and my best friend, betrayed me. He took our most promising project, a revolutionary data compression algorithm, and sold it to a competitor before disappearing with the money." Alara listened, a knot tightening in her stomach. This wasn't the father her mother had described in her rare, lucid moments. Her father was a dreamer, a kind soul who loved science and sang her to sleep. "That can't be true," she whispered. "My mother. She always said he was a good man. She said something terrible happened, something he was framed for. But her memory, it's not clear anymore. What does she remember?" Arthur pressed, leaning forward. "Fights, whispers. A man who used to visit, someone he argued with. She remembers my father packing a bag in a hurry, telling her he had to go away to protect us. He promised he would send for us. He kissed me goodbye, and we never saw him again." Alara's voice cracked. "We were left with nothing. We lost our house. We moved from place to place. It's been a struggle my whole life." Arthur's gaze softened with a flicker of empathy. He slid a photograph across the desk. It showed two young men in their early 20s, arms slung around each other, grinning in front of a garage piled high with computer parts. One was a younger, happier Arthur. The other was unmistakably her father. "We started in that garage," Arthur said, a melancholic tone in his voice. "We were going to change the world together. I believed in him more than I believed in myself." He tapped the file. But the evidence was clear. The patent was filed by a rival company a week after he vanished. The money from the sale was traced to an offshore account in his name. He was gone. But what if the evidence was wrong? Alara asked, her voice filled with a desperate conviction. What if someone else was involved? That man my mother remembers. Before Arthur could respond, the study doors opened, and a younger man in a perfectly tailored suit strode in. He was handsome, with a practiced smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Uncle Arthur," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I came as soon as I heard you brought a guest. I'm Julian Sterling." He turned his smile on Alara, but it felt like an assessment. "And you must be the waitress." The way he said the word, dripping with condescension, made Alara's skin crawl. This was Julian Sterling, Arthur's nephew and the current COO of Sterling Corporation. He was the public face of the empire, the polished successor to the reclusive founder. "Alara is helping me with a personal matter, Julian," Arthur said, his tone clipped. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze flicking from Alara to the open file on the desk. A flicker of something, recognition, alarm, passed through his expression before it was smoothed over again. "A personal matter involving a diner waitress? How intriguing. I hope you're not allowing yourself to be taken advantage of, Uncle. People can be very creative when they smell money." "That's enough," Arthur warned. "I'm just concerned," Julian said, his voice a veneer of solicitous care. "This company, this family, has a legacy to protect. We can't afford to be distracted by fanciful stories from strangers. Whatever this young woman thinks she knows, it's likely a misunderstanding, or worse, a fabrication." He looked directly at Alara, his smile gone. "My uncle has been through enough. He doesn't need old wounds reopened by someone looking for a payday." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Alara felt a hot flush of anger and humiliation. She wasn't a gold digger. She was a daughter searching for the truth about her father. Before she could defend herself, Arthur stood up, a protective authority radiating from him. "Julian, your concern is noted, but unnecessary. Alara is my guest. She will be treated with respect," he stated, an iron finality in his voice. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." Julian held his uncle's gaze for a beat too long, an unspoken challenge passing between them. Then he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and turned to leave. "Of course, Uncle. As you wish." As he walked out, he cast one last, lingering look at Alara. A look of pure, unadulterated suspicion that promised this was far from over. His presence had shifted the atmosphere in the room, turning a quest for truth into a confrontation. Alara realized with a sinking feeling that she wasn't just digging into the past. She was stepping onto a battlefield, and she had just met the enemy. After Julian's chilling departure, a heavy silence settled in the study. Arthur seemed to retreat into himself, the brief spark of hope in his eyes dimmed by his nephew's cynicism. He stared at the file on his desk as if it were a monument to his own foolishness. "Perhaps he's right," Arthur murmured, more to himself than to Alara. "Perhaps I'm just an old man chasing ghosts." "No," Alara said, her voice firm, surprising them both. "He's wrong. I'm not after your money, Mr. Sterling. I'm after my father. The man in that recording, the man in that photograph. He deserves to have his real story told." Her conviction seemed to steady him. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not a threat, but an ally. "Call me Arthur," he said quietly. "If we're going to do this, we do it together." He pushed the file aside. "This is the official story. The lie I've lived with. The truth, if it exists, must be somewhere else." He led her out of the study and down a long, sterile hallway to a heavy steel door. He pressed his thumb to a biometric scanner, and the door clicked open, revealing a climate-controlled archive room. It was filled with dozens of sealed boxes. When Daniel disappeared, I couldn't bring myself to throw his things away. I packed up his office, his notes, his personal effects, and I locked them in here. For hours, they worked, opening boxes that hadn't seen the light of day in 25 years. They were filled with schematics, technical manuals, and half-finished projects. But in one of the last boxes, tucked beneath a stack of research papers, was a smaller, personal container. Inside were photographs, a worn paperback novel, and a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. They were letters between Arthur and Daniel. Alara's hands trembled as she untied the ribbon. They read them together, their heads bent over the delicate pages. The letters painted a vivid picture of a deep, powerful friendship. They weren't just business partners. They were brothers. They wrote of shared dreams, inside jokes, and a fierce, mutual loyalty. They discussed the algorithm which they'd nicknamed Project Chimera, not as a product but as their legacy. "My dearest Arthur," Alara read aloud from one of Daniel's letters, her voice thick with emotion. "I know the pressure is mounting from the investors. They see dollar signs. But we must remember why we started this. Chimera isn't just a tool for corporations. It's a key. It can democratize information. We have to protect it, protect our vision." In another, Arthur had replied, "They'll never understand, will they, Dan? It's you and me against the world. Always." The letters were a testament to a bond that seemed unbreakable. There was no hint of discord, no sign of the betrayal to come. Then they reached the last letter in the stack. It was from Daniel, dated just 2 weeks before he vanished. "Arthur," it read, "we need to talk. I'm worried about your brother, Robert. He's been asking too many questions about Chimera's security protocols. He says he's just curious, but something feels wrong. He's pushing for us to take on a new investor, a man I don't trust. Be careful. I have a bad feeling about this. Robert, Julian's father, Arthur's late brother." A sudden, cold dread washed over Alara. They looked at each other, the same question hanging in the air. The official narrative had never mentioned Robert's involvement. "My brother?" Arthur whispered, his face pale. "He was always in Julian's ear. He was jealous of what Daniel and I had built." They searched the box frantically. "There must be more," Alara said. "A response from you, another letter from him." But there was nothing. The correspondence stopped cold, right at the precipice of a revelation. The most crucial part of the story was missing. The discovery of the letters didn't solve the mystery. It blew it wide open, pointing toward a conspiracy far darker and more personal than a simple act of greed. The ghost of her father was no longer just a victim. He was a Cassandra, crying out a warning that no one had heard. A few days later, Alara was in the penthouse study alone, poring over the letters again, when Julian entered without knocking. His polished smile was back, but it seemed sharper, more predatory than before. "Still playing detective?" he asked, his tone light and mocking. He perched on the edge of the desk, invading her space. "You know, I've been thinking about you, Alara. About your situation." Alara stiffened, pulling the letters closer to her chest. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A sick mother, crippling debt. It's a sad story. A very compelling 1 inch." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "My uncle, he's old. He's sentimental. This trip down memory lane is confusing him, dredging up old pain. It's not good for him. It's not good for the company." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a checkbook and a pen. He scribbled something quickly, tore out the check, and slid it across the desk toward her. Alara glanced down. It was made out to her. The amount made her stomach lurch. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. Enough to pay for her mother's treatments 100 times over. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "A solution," Julian said smoothly. "For everyone. You take this, you pay your mother's bills, you start a new life. All you have to do is disappear. Sign a small non-disclosure agreement saying this was all a misunderstanding and walk away. Let my uncle have his peace." The offer was a punch to the gut. It was everything she needed. A simple, easy way out of the crushing desperation that had defined her life. For a fleeting second, she pictured it. Her mother, healthy and smiling. A small apartment without the threat of eviction. A life without the constant, gnawing fear. It was a tempting vision. Julian saw the flicker of hesitation in her eyes and pressed his advantage. "Think of it as a severance package," he said, his smile widening. "For services rendered in reminding my uncle of the past. It's a generous offer. The only one you'll get. But then she looked at the letters on the desk, at her father's looping, hopeful script. She thought of his laugh on the recording. He had been trying to warn Arthur. He had been trying to protect their dream. Taking this money would be the real betrayal. It would mean his name would remain tarnished forever. His true story buried under a lie paid for with blood money. It would mean that Julian and whatever he was hiding had won. Slowly, deliberately, Alara pushed the check back across the desk. "No," she said. Julian's smile faltered. "I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted, standing up to face him, her fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "You think you can buy my silence. You think my father's honor has a price tag. You're wrong." She picked up the check, and with a steady hand, ripped it in two. "My father was a good man, and I'm going to prove it." Julian's mask of civility fell away, replaced by a flash of pure fury. The cold calculation in his eyes turned to ice. "You've just made a very big mistake," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. He snatched the torn pieces of the check from her hand and stormed out of the room, leaving Alara's heart pounding not with fear, but with the unshakable certainty that she had just passed a critical test. She had chosen the truth over comfort, and in doing so had declared war. When Arthur returned, Alara told him everything, about Julian's visit, the check, the threat. She expected anger, but instead, she saw a profound sadness in his eyes, followed by a renewed, steely determination. Her refusal to take the money had erased any lingering doubt he might have had about her character. She was Daniel's daughter, through and through. "He's hiding something," Arthur said, his voice grim. "My brother, Robert, he passed away 10 years ago. He was always the ambitious one, the one who resented my success. And Julian. He learned everything from his father." Arthur's mind was racing, connecting dots that had been obscured for decades. The letters mentioned Robert was asking about security. "The old office, my original office in the downtown tower. After Daniel left, I moved headquarters, but I kept the old suite. Couldn't let it go. There was a safe in that office behind a bookshelf. A safe only Daniel and I knew the combination to." Hope, fierce and bright, surged through Alara. Within the hour, they were standing in the dusty, forgotten office suite. It was a time capsule from 25 years ago. Furniture was draped in white sheets, and the air was thick with the scent of old paper and stale memories. Arthur went to a large, ornate bookshelf, ran his hands along the spines of the books, and pressed a hidden switch. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a heavy, formidable safe. "He told me once that if anything ever happened to him, the truth would be in a place only a brother would look," Arthur murmured, his fingers trembling as he turned the dial. He entered a sequence of numbers, not a birth date or an anniversary, but the coordinates of the spot where they had first decided to start their company. The lock clicked. With a deep breath, he pulled the heavy door open. Inside, untouched by time, sat a small, locked metal box. Next to it was a leather-bound journal. Arthur lifted the journal out as if it were a sacred relic. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Daniel's. "My private log," the first entry read. "Because I fear my words are no longer safe, even with Arthur." They sat on the floor of the dusty office, and Arthur began to read aloud. The journal was a harrowing, real-time account of Daniel's final weeks. It detailed how Robert Sterling had systematically worked to drive a wedge between the partners, feeding Arthur lies about Daniel's supposed secret meetings with competitors. He wrote of Robert's obsession with Project Chimera, his attempts to gain access to the source code, and his increasingly threatening behavior. The final entry, dated the day he disappeared, laid out the entire, devastating truth. "Robert came to me tonight," Arthur read, his voice cracking. "He brought 2 men with him. He confessed everything. He'd been selling company secrets for months. He'd already stolen the Chimera patent and sold it through a shell corporation, framing me for it all. He said Arthur would believe it because he'd been poisoning his mind against me for weeks. He gave me a choice. disappear and let the world believe I was a traitor, or he would harm my family, my wife, my little Alara. He shoved a plane ticket and a bank card for an offshore account into my hand. It was a cage, not an escape. I have to go. It's the only way to keep them safe. I tried to call Arthur, to leave him one last message, but they took my phone. I hope somehow, someday he finds this. Tell him I never betrayed him. Tell him to protect my family. Tell him his brother is a monster. Tears streamed down Alara's face as she listened. It was all there. Her father wasn't a traitor. He was a hero who had sacrificed his name, his life's work, and his future to protect his family. Arthur closed the journal, his body shaking with a mixture of grief and rage. He finally understood. The betrayal hadn't come from his best friend. It had come from his own blood. And Julian, who had inherited his father's position and his secrets, had spent his life perpetuating that lie to protect his own power and inheritance. The cascade of revelations was complete, washing away a quarter-century of bitterness and leaving only the cold, hard, and actionable truth. The following day, an emergency board meeting was called at Sterling Corporation. Julian, assuming his uncle was still wallowing in sentimentality, strode into the boardroom with an air of supreme confidence. He took his seat at the head of the table, a position he clearly felt was his by right. The other board members, all loyal to Julian, settled in, expecting a routine update. Then the doors opened, and Arthur Sterling walked in. He hadn't attended a board meeting in over a decade, and his presence sent a ripple of shock through the room. Beside him, walking with a quiet and unshakable dignity, was Alara. "Uncle," Julian said, his confident smile faltering. "What is this? I wasn't aware you would be joining us. There are some things that require my personal attention," Arthur said, his voice like ice. He didn't take a seat. He and Alara stood at the end of the long table, facing Julian like judges. For 25 years, this company has been built on a foundation of lies. Today, the truth comes out. He placed Daniel Archer's leather-bound journal on the polished table. It landed with a soft, definitive thud that echoed in the silent room. "What is that?" Julian scoffed, trying to regain control. "Some old diary? This is a board meeting, not a therapy session. This," Arthur announced, his voice ringing with authority, "is the final testament of my partner, Daniel Archer, a man whose name was destroyed by your father, Robert Sterling." He proceeded to read the final, damning entry from the journal. As the words filled the room, detailing Robert's treachery, the frame-up, the theft of Project Chimera, and the threat against Daniel's family, the color drained from Julian's face. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their gazes darting from Arthur to his stunned nephew. When Arthur finished, the silence was absolute. "This is absurd," Julian sputtered, his voice rising in panic. "A ridiculous, unproven story from a book you conveniently just found. It's the word of a traitor against my father, a respected man, and you're taking the word of this girl." He pointed a trembling finger at Alara. "She's a nobody, a grifter who has clearly manipulated an old man." Alara met his gaze, her expression calm and steady. "My father was not a traitor," she said, her voice clear and strong. "He was a victim, and you have known it all along. Prove it." Julian snarled, his arrogance turning to desperation. "I believe we can," Arthur said. He nodded to his assistant, who dimmed the lights and turned on a projector. An image flashed on the screen, a bank statement from a shell corporation, showing the original sale of the Chimera patent. And then another document appeared, a wire transfer from that same corporation, for a substantial sum, into a private trust. "A trust," Arthur explained, his voice cold as steel. "That was established by Robert Sterling and whose sole beneficiary, upon his death, became his son, Julian Sterling. You've been living off the money your father stole from Daniel Archer your entire adult life." The final piece of evidence locked into place. It was undeniable. Julian stared at the screen, trapped. His arrogance, the source of his power, became his undoing. "It was my inheritance," he shouted, finally confessing through his rage. "It was my father's legacy. That pathetic dreamer Archer would have run this company into the ground. My father did what was necessary. I just protected his legacy. My legacy." The outburst hung in the air, a raw and ugly admission of guilt. The board members stared at him in horror. In his desperate attempt to defend his father's actions, he had just admitted his own complicity. The confrontation was over. The lie was dead. The fallout was swift and absolute. Faced with irrefutable evidence and his own damning confession, Julian Sterling was unanimously removed from the board and fired from his position as COO. The legal ramifications followed quickly. A full investigation was launched into the corporate espionage and fraud perpetrated by his father, and Julian himself faced charges for conspiracy and his own financial crimes. The Sterling empire, built on a secret shame, was finally cleansed. Arthur moved immediately to right the wrongs of the past. He called a press conference not to gloat, but to publicly exonerate his friend. He told the world the true story of Daniel Archer, the brilliant, loyal partner who had been unjustly maligned. He then formally recognized Alara as her father's sole heir. The shares in the company that Robert had stolen, which had passed to Julian, were legally transferred to her. Overnight, the struggling Waitress became a majority shareholder in the corporation her father had helped create. With her newfound resources, Alara ensured her mother received the best medical care in the world. As her mother's health slowly began to improve, the lines of worry on Alara's face began to soften, replaced by a quiet strength and a sense of profound peace. The crushing weight of survival was lifted, and for the first time she could simply be a daughter. Her relationship with Arthur solidified into a familial bond, forged in their shared quest for justice. He was no longer a reclusive billionaire, but a man given a second chance at loyalty, a chance to honor the memory of the brother he had chosen, not the one he was born with. A few weeks later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Alara and Arthur stood together on a quiet, grassy hill in a small, forgotten cemetery. They were in front of a simple, unmarked plot. For years, this was all Alara and her mother could afford for the man who had vanished. Now, a beautiful new headstone of polished granite stood in its place. It read, "Daniel Archer, a loving father, a brilliant mind, a true partner." Alara placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at its base. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying away the last vestiges of a long and painful chapter. She had not only cleared her father's name, but she had finally brought him home. "He would have been so proud of you," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. Alara looked at the name carved into the stone, and then at the vast open sky. She had found more than just justice. She had found her own history, her own strength, and a future her father had sacrificed everything for. The truth, once buried, had a way of fighting its way to the light. And sometimes, it takes just one person, armed with nothing but integrity and love, to help it break free. For in the end, what greater inheritance can there be than a legacy of truth? If this story of truth and vindication touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspirational content that proves goodness will always find its way.